Hi, everyone. Welcome to Just a Minute with me, Dr. Kamari Valentine. It's winter here, well and truly, in the Southern Hemisphere and Dunedin, specifically where I live. And every single winter in Dunedin, I'm so surprised by how cold it is. I have a feeling that that's about the kind of cognitive dissonance we as Dunedinites do um, in order to love living here in Dunedin, which I think is the best city in the world, which is a tall claim, but I really love Dunedin. However, winter, along with being cold, also brings a whole lot of very predictable effects on our mood. And many of you will be familiar with the concept of seasonal affective disorder. So even if somebody is not clinically depressed and meets criteria for seasonal affective disorder, it is extremely likely that many people will notice a dip in mood and some aspects that might look like depression. So let's take a wee step back, though, and talk about what we mean when we're talking about depression or meeting criteria for a major depressive episode during seasonal affective disorder. We are talking about persistent sadness, persistent low mood that lasts 2 weeks or longer, even if there are periods where there might be patches of brightness. But it's that sense of a persistent low mood. There are issues of concentration, so it becomes really hard to concentrate. There are really profound feelings of guilt, as if you're to blame, or things just feel stickier in that guilt sphere than might be usual. There are changes in appetite, so people might notice that they're reaching for those comfort foods more, or there might be a real decrease in appetite. People say they just don't feel like eating. And I notice this for clients uh, where there is an anxiety component, that anxiety has just really restricted that appetite, that tummy. But even without anxiety, a hallmark feature of depression is a change in appetite or weight. There are also changes in sleeping, which can be hypersomnia, sleeping too much, or insomnia, difficulty getting to or staying asleep. There is a feeling of sluggishness or agitation. There are feelings of life not being worth living. And I just really want to remind everyone that there are helplines. And if you are starting to feel like life is not worth living, it is really important to reach out. In addition, there can be a loss of interest, a loss of joy, and finding pleasure. So, anhedonia refers to that lack of pleasure and a loss of energy, with people reporting fatigue. Okay, so those symptoms are much more likely during times of diminished light. I'm just moving between a few screens to share a couple of studies with you. So, this was a study published in June 2023 by Wang and colleagues in the Journal of Risk Management and Healthcare Policy. And what I liked about the study was that they were looking at a special population, operating room nurses, and they had quite a large number of nurses. They interviewed 787 nurses who were working long hours in operating rooms and had limited sunlight exposure. And there are other professions where there is this diminished ability to seek sunlight or to be working in sunlight, to be working long hours, and sunlight exposure is less during winter. And what they found was that with less sunlight, there was poorer mental health and poorer sleep regularity. And the poorer one's mental health was, the greater the likelihood of chronic disease. Remember that another thing that we need in order to sleep is melatonin. So melatonin regulates sleep and wake, and we need exposure exposure to light to help us. So light influences our body's circadian rhythm, and when it's light outside, our body knows that it's time to be alert, to be awake. And when it is dark, our body naturally gets ready to slow down and go to sleep. Unfortunately, artificial light has really disrupted the circadian rhythm. Light also affects melatonin, the sleep hormone, by activation of the pineal gland. And the brain starts producing melatonin in response to darkness. But certain types of light prevent that melatonin, such as the blue light from cell phones. Some of my clients have had benefit, by the way, from hiring the lights that you get in order to help get more sunlight during winter, just as an idea. But speaking of ideas, I had a few more. So you've heard me talking about nutrition before, and nutrition profoundly affects our mood. The relationship, though, is not, it can become chicken and egg. And this was the second article I had here. So this is food and mood. How do diet and nutrition affect mental well-being? By Firth and colleagues, published in 2020 in the British Medical Journal and accessed online. As you probably know, certain patterns of eating, such as the Mediterranean diet, are associated with better health outcomes. And those affect not just the gut microbiome, which is so foundational in our regulation of our immune system and mood, but also in a whole range of other processes. So I'm just picking out bits to read. So a Mediterranean diet is associated with reduced risk for depression, but the nature of these relations is complicated by the potential for reverse causality. For example, when we're struggling, we might reach for comfort foods, or when we're feeling stressed. And there might be barriers to maintaining that healthier way of eating. But what we know is that a good quality diet affects inflammation, affects our neural pathways and hormonal signaling. And what the evidence is very clear about is that depression is associated with inflammation. And in this article, I found something. I should have highlighted it. I'm just trying to find it again. Before I get to that part, high dietary glycemic load and the resultant compensatory responses could lower plasma glucose to concentrations that trigger the secretion of autonomic counter-regulatory hormones such as cortisol, adrenaline, growth hormone, and glucagon. Okay, so various mental health conditions, including mood disorders, have been linked to heightened inflammation. And this is a mechanism through which poor diet can increase the risk of depression. The causal role of dietary inflammation has not yet been established. But they reference a study that shows that medications that stimulate inflammation typically induce depressive states, and that giving omega-3 fatty acids, which have anti-inflammatory processes, seem to prevent the onset of cytokine-induced depression. And there was something else in here which I will try to find at some stage, which was about some promising evidence that taking that anti-inflammatory approach worked. So, one tip I have for winter, one evidence-based tip, is about looking at the very food that might be nourishing you or not. And while it is difficult because cold weather may have us reach for foods that we have seen or experienced as comforting, making a change can really be beneficial. And if you've been following me for some time, you know that the chef who I regard highly is Bridget Foliaki Davis, who, along with Bridget's Healthy Kitchen, has thousands of recipes that are anti inflammatory and that are comforting and yummy. Okay, next tip is about activity scheduling. So, this is something that we standardly do when we're looking at low mood. When I worked on acute inpatient units, which were the jobs in two places that I did when I worked for the public system, uh, one of the things I would do on the ward was start looking at improving structure. I had a little saying that as things start becoming more chaotic or we're feeling more stressed, our structure needs to really tighten. So, a simple structure is about really making clear wake time, going to bedtime, and meals, right? Then you might start layering in some other things. We don't want to schedule every minute of the day, but we want a very clear, predictable, and consistent structure that is extraordinarily hard to do, and it is highly evidence based when looking at improving mood. We start with that basic structure and then we try to put in activities that bring in a little bit of pleasure. We call this pleasant event scheduling. It doesn't mean going for expensive or really high emotion activities, but simple types of pleasure. I say the more sustainable, the better. And there are lists of pleasurable events if you Google them. Pleasurable events can include kicking leaves, having a hot drink, listening to a favorite radio show, simply sitting and stroking a pet, like a pet cat, if your cat will allow you, getting a book from the library, those things that might only increase that sense of pleasure from 0 to 0.5, 1 or 2, but they are small, subtle improvements in mood. After scheduling in pleasurable events, and my challenge would be to have at least one daily, the next recommendation would be around scheduling in mastery events. These are events where we get a sense of satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment. And again, we're not going for a 10 out of 10 mastery. We're not saying learn a new language overnight. We're talking about a small sense of accomplishment. small and sustainable is the way to go. Next, you will know that various techniques such as mindfulness have a strong evidence base. I think there's a misconception that mindfulness is about emptying your mind or in some way not thinking about things or maybe even blocking things out. In fact, I would say mindfulness is about being non-judgmental. So rather than evaluating yourself, your experience, your interpretation of the world, your body and space, all of those things in a very judgmental um, or a way that is evaluative, we try to see the world as it is. We try to take a step back and see our experiences as passing phenomena, even for a moment. I went to a talk once where this really wonderful, gentle clinical psychologist was talking. In fact, he was talking about Qigong, but he said that mindfulness without attention, which is the construct that we're playing with in mindfulness, attention without compassion is simply an assassin. So the second component that I think is important is this business of compassion, like really being gentle and compassionate with ourselves, treating ourselves like our own best friend. And this reminds me that if that is something you would like to expand, your capacity for deeper self-care, that capacity for compassion, minimizing that critical tone, nourishing that healthy adult, then my new course on deeper self-care is online and available, and I made it with the aim of covering these foundational topics that crop up always in therapy, and that is available on Gumroad. I also would like to say that therapy is likely to be extremely useful, even if it's brief. It can be really hard to get out of habitual patterns of thinking. If it was easy, you would have done it a long time ago. So reaching out and working with another human being, having the courage to be vulnerable and exploring patterns, perhaps that have tripped you up, or patterns that are emerging in the context of less light, less activities, the kind of everyday stress that accompanies everyone feeling this way. It can be useful to talk to a professional. And remember that there are a wide variety of professionals. What is important is finding somebody that you click with. So what I really want you to know is that depression or low mood is something you can do something about. You can definitely feel better than you might be. And I hope this has been useful. So as always, let me know if you have any questions or if there are some other topics you'd like me to cover. Take care and talk soon.